Hey guys, this is 3.3, step 1, and the learning objective is students will be able to read chapters 4 and 5 of While the Locust Slept and analyze the two-timeline narrative structure. So let's get started. What is narrative structure, first of all? Well, it's how the book is organized. Where we start, what happens next, where we end. You can think of it as a map of the events in a story or an outline of a story, but it's really how everything is connected together. Let's think about some books that we've already read. We read the play A Raisin in the Sun first semester, and in A Raisin in the Sun, we start off in the younger home the morning of a work week, right? And everybody's getting ready for work. And then we see another day in their life a few days later. And then we see another day in their life a couple weeks later. And then finally another day. And then that last scene is the moving day, right? Where they're moving out of the apartment. But all of these events that we see in the play are organized into a particular narrative structure. There is an order of events. And Lorraine Hansberry chose what that order of events, what that narrative structure was as she was writing her play. Now, last year you also read a novel of Mice and Men that has a similar narrative structure in that things all happen in a short period of time, right? At the beginning of this book, we meet George and Lenny as they arrive at the new farm where they're going to start working, right? And then we see their lives on this farm every, few days and see the events evolve. Then by the end of the book, it's, leaving the farm, basically, right? So we have in both of these works a really focused narrative structure, just one timeline, one particular place, one, tracing the lives of just a few characters. All right, well, in our book, While the Locust Slept, we have a two-timeline narrative structure. And a two-timeline narrative structure is different. You've probably seen some of these before, and I'm going to try to jog your memory to think of some. But it's the organization of a story using two separate timelines. In A Raisin in the Sun, we just have the one timeline. We just have the younger family in that year, in those days. In Of Mice and Men, we have just George and Lenny in that year, in those particular days. In While the Locust Slept, we have two separate timelines. Do you know this movie, The Princess Bride? Here's an example of a story that has two separate timelines. In this movie, we first see this child who is sick, and his grandfather comes over and he's going to tell him a story, right? And then the other timeline is the story that is told. And we've got, pirates and people avenging fathers' deaths and all the things that happen in Princess Bride. So they're two totally separate timelines existing in the same movie. Another one that has two separate timelines is The Lion King. In The Lion King, we have at the beginning events that happen when Simba is a little child. Right, and it ends that timeline ends roughly with the death of his father, and of course he feels guilty for it, so he leaves. And then later we see him as an adult, and eventually he comes back, right, and avenges his father's death by fighting with Scar after he learns the truth about how his dad died. So we have two separate timelines, but unlike our book that we're reading now, they don't happen at the same time. We see what happened before in the beginning of the movie, and then we see what happens later in the movie, and we don't really go back and forth. In While the Locust Slept, we go back and forth. So in the beginning, in the first 15 pages, we are mostly just at the state school. We don't hear much that happens later. But then after that, starting with the second reading and then throughout the rest of the book, we really go back and forth from paragraph to paragraph. Like here's an example on page 40. It starts in the current timeline where Peter's life is described after leaving the state school at Owatonna and living on the Shawlses' farm, right? He's talking about Geordie and the Shawlses. But then in the very next chapter, we are dropped back into the past timeline, life at the state school. And we hear about C-15, which he lived at from, when he was a little child, like up till about age 10 or so. So we know that this is happening a long time before. And the book switches back and forth, sometimes really without us having much warning. And so we have to be prepared for that in While the Locust Slept. Well, what are some of the effects of a two-timeline narrative structure? In each example, The Princess Bride, The Lion King, and While the Locust Slept, we can see some of these effects, I think. First of all, it creates connections between events. In the example I just showed you, we heard about how Emmett's death drowning reminded Peter of a past death when he was younger, right? And so it creates that connection. It also shows a character's reaction, and maybe we understand why certain things affect Peter the way they do later on in the book. And, because we see how these things happen in his younger years. Also, it builds curiosity and tension. We wonder, well, is the Shawls farm situation going to go any differently than the state school? And it also follows the narrator's train of thought. Like in that last one, he says, it made me think back. And then, of course, we're told why he's thinking back into the past. So these are all some different effects, and you can watch for the effects in this reading as you learn more about Peter's time at the state school, which will now move in chronological order from early to later, and then also his life on the Shawls farm at the same time, which moves chronologically in order from, 9th grade to 10th grade, etc. All right, I think that's all we've got here. So good luck as you read 3.3.